Welcome to the Guest House. I'm Sean Perel. I'm an integrative therapist, a yoga and meditation teacher, a lifelong student of the thesis of our belonging, and I'm also a parent and a fellow human being grappling with many of the same questions that you may be grappling with too. In these conversations, I'm turning to some of the folks I most admire, and together we're exploring the complexities and also the creative potential of being human in an era of radical change. Thank you so much for being with us.
What's the deepest silence you've ever known? You can trust the first memory that comes to you. No need to overthink it. As you remember the experience, see if you can settle into it. Recall where you are, what's happening around you, and who, if anyone, is present. See if you can summon the atmosphere, the quality of light, the mood in the air, the feeling in your body. Is it quiet to the ears? Or is it the kind of silence that comes when no person or thing is laying claim on your attention? Is it quiet in your nerves? Or is it the kind of silence that lives deeper still, like when the turbulent waters of internal chatter suddenly part, revealing a clear path forward? Take a moment to consider what might sound like a strange question. Is the silence simply the absence of noise? Or is it also a presence unto itself?
My guest today is Leigh Marz. Leigh is a leadership coach and a collaboration consultant who has led diverse initiatives, including a training program to promote an experimental mindset among multi-generational teams at NASA, and a decade-long cross-sector collaboration to reduce toxic chemicals in partnership with the Green Science Policy Institute, Harvard University, IKEA, Google Green Team, Kaiser Permanente, and many others. No big deal. Most notably, for today's conversation, Leigh is the author, along with her co-author, Justin Zorn, of Golden, The Power of Silence in a World of Noise, which has been published by HarperCollins and is now being translated into no fewer than 13 languages. So happy to have you here today with us, Leigh. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me, Sean. It's great to be here.
I wanted to share just right off the bat that it's been really a lovely experience to prepare for this conversation. It's kind of I read your book when it first came out in 2022, and then I was rereading it slowly and really like morsel by morsel, taking it in over the past few weeks. And what I noticed was that the effect of it was that I was paying more attention to pockets of silence, little moments of stillness in my everyday life, and the sort of tuning fork of silence. It brought to mind some of my earliest memories of silence, which were really just these kind of like uncliche, crystalline, sort of memories. And I also think on a very practical level, many of us feel increasingly the tension of how do we participate in the world such as it is, and also resource and replenish ourselves and, find reservoirs of renewal in our lives. And so your book is really, it's really provided a lot of rich reflection and guidance.
Oh, that makes me so happy.
I imagine that setting out to write a book about silence was daunting, right? It's like, how do you use language to convey the ineffable, the essence of silence, right? Without reducing it. And it's really quite a feat. So could we begin there just with what was the journey of sort of conceptualizing this book?
So the concept of silence did create some of that paralysis and feel daunting, like, oh gosh, it's got to be lofty and really smart and really. But if we just attuned to really the interviews we were having with people and this felt sense of silence between us in this relationship place, I'm already feeling it present here.
Mm-hmm.
So when we would attune to that, it kind of, I don't know, the words would just come and they would surprise us. And the whole book was shaped through feeling into that place of attunement with silence, and also never getting, well, not never, I mean, of course we did, but trying not to get caught up in the idea that we needed to be some kind of an expert on silence, which is truly absurd. There is no such thing as an expert on silence. And even the people we spoke with who were who were devotees and who had such beautiful practices and such wonderful things to say and insights would never claim to be experts on silence. So with that aside, with kind of like maybe not weighing too heavily on this expert model of writing a book and trying our best to not get caught in the concept of it and instead the felt sense of it and that connection, it just started to flow. So it was truly one of the most blessed, like inspiring, incredible, expansive, joyful experiences, especially to work with my beloved partner, Justin, who just became my brother in this process. He is my brother. It was an incredible experience, one I'll always be grateful for.
The experience of reading it, it feels like is sort of like there's just a thread that you're kind of following through it, almost not in a sense of like, we've got this mastered and we're going to sort of transmit it through this book. It comes through in just the way that you're describing as an exploration, as, layers upon layers of sort of inquiring and learning and growing into. And I think it's one of the things that felt so resonant to me about Golden. I want to back up for a minute because I don't think we can talk about silence before we talk about noise.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like
that's the problem. Yeah.
And you share a quote from Blaise Pascal, who's the 17th century philosopher, polymath, who says, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. And I think we all at some level sense that we're living inside a very noisy time in history. So can we begin with just how do you define noise according to the categories you outline as, auditory, informational, and internal in the book?
Mm-hmm. Noise could be defined many different ways. We could have looked at it many different ways. In fact, one person said to us, you're probably trying to take too much on with these three categories, which I'll go into in a second. Maybe you should just do auditory noise. And our response was, like there is a big problem there. There's a lot you could. Our response was profound, like, no, because what we were so interested in was, of course, what's happening in the auditory soundscape. It's louder than ever. It's just decibels, what we tend to think of as noise, so like that which hits our ears and even our nervous systems. We can feel that like in a really loud environment with big booms and stuff. So we do explore that, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a sec. But in this day and age, it felt important to take on informational noise, that which is coming through us through devices primarily at an alarming speed. So in terms of auditory noise, we know it's getting louder. We can measure all these things like these proxy indicators like emergency ambulance sirens, which are so many more times loud, 6 times louder than they were just, a few decades ago, to get our attention, because it has to cut through the noise, the din, in order to grab our attention. So that level, it just tells us what our cityscapes are doing. And then, where the Park Services estimates that noise pollution has increased threefold. And then we know that impacts, of course, all the natural, all these animals and life and, mating calls and different things. And even just what happened during 9/11 in terms of the shipping industry stopping for a short period of time, and COVID with airline, we saw behaviors of whales and animals change in that time. So there's just a lot of really fascinating, very troubling data about the auditory landscape getting louder and louder, and the impact on our hearing, on our wellness, on our health, and in all different kinds of ways. But to stop there wasn't really satisfactory for us. It didn't really describe just the pure level of problem we were experiencing, but also this informational. What we mean is that, with information, it's data. When neutral, it's like data, but it's these things grabbing for your attention. With information, that in 2010, Eric Schmidt, the then CEO of Google, made an estimate that every 2 days we create as much information as we did from the dawn of civilization to 2003. So the mass proliferation of mental stuff, information out there for us to varying degrees of quality, it's just astonishing. And our attentional capacities, what we can process and through our brains, that capacity hasn't increased. So we have a problem, with that mass proliferation of information, and then there's a attention problem. And we were feeling that internally as well as seeing that kind of externally. And then I guess the area that felt most fascinating to me personally, I think Justin would agree, is what does that do to our internal landscapes, our internal soundscapes, the rumination, thoughts, fixations, future planning, dread about the past, all these things. And so there's new data about that. Ethan Cross from University of Michigan says that we listen to an equivalent of 320 State of the Union addresses every day. That's of internal monologue and chatter of varying degrees of usefulness. It can get quite negative, quite harmful, as we know, just that self-talk, talk about ourselves to ourselves. So if we take the auditory landscape and the informational grabbing of our attention, and then what we then experience from the inside, it's a very loud world. So as we were feeling that, our intuition was to turn towards silence, that maybe some of the solutions for this problem might not come from more thinking and talking, but might be found in silence.
Yeah, there was, I'm remembering this quote from a neuroscientist that you interviewed, Judson Brewer, who talks about like drinking from a fire hose, literally, like what his experience of drinking from a fire hose when it comes to really all three. But I think he was referring specifically to the informational noise, which seems sort of most exponentially increased in recent time.
Right. I don't know if we got this actually in the book, but I remember him talking to us just as how like parents have more information about their kids, so that you can track your kid and you see where they are. They're here, they're there. But our anxiety about that hasn't decreased. And of course, sometimes it's wrong. I occasionally see my daughter's like in the bay, where I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. So the dot for her is in the bay, like as if she's taking a swim.
Like like inside the bay.
Right. And immediately, like my mom self gets, she has this kind of trying commute to Marin from where we live. So I do sometimes like, is everything okay? Did she make it on time? Was there a lot of traffic? Well, sometimes this just creates internal noise, like that she knows she's in the bay or she's not where, but really it's a glitch in this tracking. So we have more information than ever before, but we're also more anxious than ever before. Why is that? That it didn't calm us down to get all that intel. That's just one example, but it strikes me as a parent. Yeah.
I think it's intuitively why in my therapy practice, I just always kind of come back to mindfulness practice with my clients, because it's about how do we, like being in the London Underground, when you step the space between the train and the platform, and you get this lovely voiceover that says, mind the gap, mind the gap. Like, can we put a little tiny bit more spaciousness in our internal narrative, and just kind of like, can we hold back the force of the fire hose just a little bit, give ourselves a little bit of time and space. And I think it was interesting you brought up during the pandemic, we saw nature kind of like find a little bit of the spaciousness and the kind of regenerative potential of that gap. So there's these three kinds of noise, and I think the theme that ties them together seems to be this idea of just being distracted.
Absolutely. So what they all share is their unwanted distractions. So if that noise or that auditory thing is desirable, if it's music, it's not noise, it's not unwanted distraction. If the information is really useful and it's that information we were searching for, and it does bring whatever it was, the best of what we were searching for, then it's data, or better yet, like information in the, intelligence in that kind of way. And internally, if it's, thinking that is positive, we love thinking, but if it's rumination and that unhelpful internal chatter, so that's the noise part, the unwanted piece of that distraction.
I think that then into the noise, you posed a really revelatory question. What is the deepest silence you've ever known? And you asked a really interesting, diverse group of people, artists and activists and scientists and poets and politicians, and the list goes on.
Right.
And it's really one of the things that I really most loved about the book was just just hearing about it, because I was like, oh, cool, oh, interesting how, the 4 a.m. point at the rave for some people is the equivalent of, dawn out in the mountains, or deep communion with a baby in the middle of the night, or it was such an interesting diversity of experiences. And I wonder what were the responses that most moved or surprised you?
That was, well, a lot of things. So it was so fun to speak to this totally wonderful, wild cast of characters, and basically to not be confined to any certain group. But although we did start with our mindfulness people, because we knew they would know what we were talking about. But and they did, and they pointed us in the right direction. But then as we started to expand to whirling dervish, a sound engineer, a man incarcerated on death row for a crime he didn't commit, all these different, folks getting answers like births and deaths and moments of awe, and that untrampled high mountain snow moment and things like that. It was more what we were expecting, but they were actually auditorily often quite loud. And so what was that? They also weren't alone, which might have been another sort of place of conceptual overlay where we thought of silence as being a solo endeavor, even though that actually wasn't our personal experiences. It's just more how I guess we've been sort of somewhat trained to think about it. So the fact that often silence was shared, and that was a magnifying experience, that silence was an internal experience, even though auditorily it might be quite loud, that there was that kind of difference there, that we just kept following that truth, because that's what they were telling us, and that was proving to be true when we used that same lens for ourselves. And that's what really shaped the book and made it feel really quite wondrous, we might go anywhere. And what really made it clear to us that examining internal silence was going to be kind of, was really what we were ultimately going for. That this difference between finding the true signal, being able to tune into silence versus the noise, it was really as simple as that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that pivot.
And it sort of captures your exploration of silence is not the absence of what we think about as noise auditorially, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's also not the same as solitude, right? That actually silence is this integral and transcendent concept that can be dynamic and can be shared. And it's really, I think at one point in the book, you describe it as just the pulse of life, right? Like that true signal.
that's how I came to find it, is that it just felt like silence is the sound of life. And of course, life has lots of sounds, but they're just life, like pulsing and growing and reaching for the sun or those kinds of things. That, for me, it's sort of the definition I'm sitting with now and enjoying.
Mm. Will you share with us any of the experiences that you kind of tapped into in the book, of your personal experiences of kind of profound silence and where they were unexpectedly found?
Yeah, in the book, I'll speak to this, the writing experience of this too, because when I would ask myself, because I felt it was important that we ask ourselves this deepest silence question and not just ask that of others, the experience that came back to me again and again was not what I expected. It was my experience as a new mom. I have a now 18-year-old daughter. Um, and when I gave birth to her, there had been signals that there was maybe a lot of anxiety coming into this. And we'd planned a home birth and ended up being an emergency transport. There was quite a lot of um, that went into that. When we did that transport, it was a pretty horrific storm, quite frightening. And then we made it, and she was safe and everything. But I seemed to have kicked into quite a manic period, and I was like a hypervigilance, like I was going to do it right and do it perfectly. And I didn't. It might sound strange, but I didn't realize that I wasn't sleeping, and I wasn't like, barely an hour and then soon none at all. And it was about 19 days before we realized I actually hadn't slept at all. And then they ended up kind of tracking, trying to get me to sleep for another 7 days before they used this really like elephant kind of tranquilizer sort of medicine, which I hope to never have to take again. But that's what reboot my brain. But in that process, I was, there was many voices in my head telling me, I needed to kind of beat this motherhood thing and, not miss a beat in my career, to continue to entertain the parade of guests that were coming to see the baby and bring me things, which is lovely. I could also keep the grout in my kitchen clean. I could also write handwritten notes. I could also get my body back on track. I could do all those things if I just like tried hard enough. So that was like one character in my brain. And then there was another character that was recognizing this sense of madness that had set in, but just treated it a bit like an escape room I had to think my way out of. And then another voice that was like, yeah, and to think your way out of it, you'll just capture every moment, all your brilliant thoughts. So I was actually compulsively recording myself as well, and many, 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 many other voices. And so it was clear, like, okay, I'm not sleeping. I'm kind of losing my mind here. There's a lot going on. And so I'm sitting in a psychiatrist's office, Dr. T, when he asked me if I ever lost my witness. And when he asked me that question, everything went quiet for a moment, and all those voices stepped aside, and something else in me felt completely quiet and answered him with, yes, but only once. And I knew that was true. But I felt my own quiet. I also felt like some expansive, larger silence that was holding me, that conveyed it would be okay. My relationship with my daughter would be fine. My marriage would endure. I will come back online, and back into center. It was so reassuring. And so this is the story that kept like coming in. It wanted to be told, the deepest silence. I just thought, oh, that's just such a complicated story. And it's just so much. And there's so many other things, but it felt important to honor that was true. That was one of the deepest silences. That place of reassurance is that profound reassurance, is one that we heard at different times. It wasn't about, death. It wasn't a birth, but it was somewhere in between where I was really in a crisis point, and silence was there for me. So, yeah.
No, I want to just say I'm so grateful for the courage in sharing this story, because it immediately, I resonated. It was like, oh, this is actually like, we can talk to, you know, the meditators on the mountains about silence, but when we really dig into our own journey of consciousness, of, like Susan Sontag talks about, right, experiences that leave silence in their wake, the words that are spoken, or a question that is asked, or a death, or a birth, or these moments when something opens that really that we can only bow to, and it's humbling. So I so deeply appreciated your willingness to share from such a tender memory of a time in your life. And the reflection in my own life was a time when I was experiencing panic attacks, like really intensely, and I felt so out of control of like, what is going on with my body? And I hadn't yet really begun the process of integration and healing that was necessary to make sense of, well, where are these, you know, panic attacks coming from? And I remember a moment of kind of like feeling like I was just going to like completely unravel, you know, like that my psyche was just going to completely unravel, and going out and sitting on the beach by myself at night, you know, and the sound of the ocean, just the rhythmic, almost like the rhythmic soothing of being in the ocean, the vastness of the view, and just all of my senses just kind of coming into. I remember that there was almost an internal, like, speaking of the tuning fork, of just like shh, like the whole ocean was just saying shh, and it was a still point for me in the midst of a lot of noise. And I wonder if, you know, I think that a lot of people can relate to those kinds of moments, though we don't speak about them very often with each other.
Absolutely. I mean, I have to say, like, each time we would speak with someone deeply and bring this question in, whenever that right moment felt, it's so sacred, just felt so sacred. I feel a little teary remembering. It's really just the preciousness of this life, the sweetness of it. These words, of course, aren't quite doing it, but we would, that connection, the connection I'd feel with those people, the reverence of silence, the reverence of these moments, and that shared connection. I mean, I would fall completely in love with each person as we got there. And just this like incredible experience of being human in this life. And silence is this beautiful witness to it, presence to it, invitation to feel into it, which is part of the terrifying part, right? I mean, I get just as squirrely about it as anybody, as much as I'm trying to learn to really, really savor and enjoy and celebrate those moments. That's just what I'm here to do, is to help bring some celebration to these moments that we overlook.
You speak in the book about the science of silence. Like, what is the biological effect of noise, and what is the biological? I mean, essentially, noise registers as stress in the body, right? And then you speak about the scientific experience of silence in the body or quiet in the body, and how deeply it can kind of reset the nervous system. When we really look into it, like, of course, the scientific basis for silence opens to the spiritual basis for silence. And John Cage's piece, right, where he just held silence for an open air concert hall in Woodstock, New York, for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, right? As you were just describing holding space for others to share in moments of silence, I just imagine being what it must have been like to be there for that piece, right? And just like, what a journey
And it changes you. Sharing that kind of silence, it changes you. It connects you in some way. And Joyce DiDonato, a beautiful opera singer, also shared this 3-year journey of her touring to talk about peace in a time of chaos and how we find that still point in chaos. What helps us find that quiet? And after those 3 years of touring all over the world, she ends up in DC, and that final note that I think extends into a lute that extends into silence, and you can't even necessarily detect those changes. It dissipates, and then like no one wants to move, even breathe, certainly not clap. It's like the quote you just brought in for Susan Sontag, like the silence that is left in its wake, and there's just this period of, I don't know, infinite possibility and eternity, all present. And then finally, we do that thing where we do celebrate what just happened. But Justin was in that audience, and it changed him. He couldn't believe that a silence like that could be shared with 2,000 people, and that they would all leave different, changed.
There's the other side of that, which was the more than 9 minutes of George Floyd's final moments of his life, and how interminable just to kind of be inside of that, like, time that just kind of undid so many layers of protection and buffering, and trying to distance from the sonder, the sense of another person's experience, feeling another person's experience.
Right. Viscerally, to get into that. Sheena Malhotra was the person who took us into that moment at a Black Lives Matter march, where that was, of course, there were like placards and slogans and things happening, but that 9.5 minutes was spent in a shared silence, kneeling with groups, hundreds of people all around. And she speaks to that, the horror and the discomfort, the horror, the connection to that experience. And then it also turning to this incredible bonding experience with the people who were there, and the young boys she was looking at, and the police officers who were there to to monitor that march, and just her own shift of emotional content and connecting to all those people, including the police who were there, that all that could happen in 9.5 minutes. In some ways, I keep coming back to how silence, how it decompresses time. It does something magical to time. So it's not about necessarily taking tons of time out and going off into the cave or the this or the that, but just really zooming in. And, when we go into some of those practicals, that's part of what makes it doable for those of us who are still in the hustle, the beautiful, magical hustle of this life, doing that. So there's that. And then it's just also that silence is a starting point to really just to honor the grief that we really carry, as well as the joy that we're experiencing, that savoring that I was talking about earlier. Like nothing meets a moment of grief like just a really profound presence in silence. I think sometimes that is the most honorable thing we can do.
I think that as you're speaking, what is sort of revealing itself is, to me, is like getting down to the most fundamental, humble experience of, what does it mean to be human, to be here, as you say, like the pulse of life, and to begin even to tap into what is this pulse of life.
So one of the things we came across was this study of a cross-disciplinary study of self-transcendent experiences, STEs. So those are experiences where some part of yourself, your egoic self, is shrinking, but you're also connecting to this larger being, that ocean. You're a drop in the ocean, but you are part of the ocean nonetheless. That experience of, connecting to the larger world, you're bigger and yet smaller. And that the common thread of activities that experience might be found through prayer, through meditation, but also through flow states, physical state. You could find that on the basketball court. You could find that in my dance class on Fridays. You can find that, you can find that looking out onto a precipice like we talked about, or behind your eye shades in a psychedelic, a wise psychedelic experience. There's just so many ways, these common denominators, all called self-transcendent experiences. So I just loved that there were so many routes to that kind of deeply quiet experience. So I was on a walk with a good friend of mine, Rebecca Solnit, and we were on a walk looking at water birds and things. And I was telling her about the framing that we already talked about, the auditory, informational, and internal. And she turned to me and said, "It's time for you to meet Jarvis." And that really was a big moment. I had no idea. Now, I'd been hearing about Jarvis for a decade. I mean, they're good friends and I hear about him. And anytime he calls, it's drop everything. They jump on the phone and talk, because it's just hard to get a call from, death row. He's an innocent man on death row, and they're trying to lay out the key witnesses, and all of those, the testimonies have all been recanted. So it was quite an honor. But then when we actually got to sort out the logistics to talk with him, it became clear that he would be the primary teacher in the book, because his ability to navigate noise through the most, really, it's insanely, chaotically, cacophonously loud in San Quentin. The surfaces are all hard, right? The cement blocks and the mesh wire, and they're open in the tiers, and men are hollering and shouting all the time, all through the night, even with night terrors, and there's the clanging and things. So it's a constant 24-hour cacophonous soundscape. One that, in fact, when he went from solitary confinement, or the AC, the adjustment center as they call it, to the East Block where he is now, the doors were thicker in solitary confinement and that was protecting him from a lot of auditory noise. When he moved to the East Block, it became so much more loud that he actually had a seizure, the worst of his life, just incapable of processing that amount of noise. So he needed to deepen his practice, which he did. He is a meditator of the Tibetan lineage. He's a long-time student, close, dear friends with Pema Chodron, and has his own practice, but he also wanted to speak to us about the many, many, many other ways he finds quiet, like studying astronomy and working out in his cell, and enjoying funk music and things like that, writing letters. He has this just a completely gorgeous penmanship and things, just so many practices to find quiet, because of course the informational, the things about the cases that are going on, all that kind of lawyers, meeting with lawyers, all those things. His case is currently on appeal. Internally, of course, he realized, even as a 19-year-old young man walking in there, he reached up and put his palm of his hand to the ceiling, and he could reach both sides of his cell. And his first thought at that moment was, "I'm being buried alive in here. I'm being buried alive in here." And he felt that kind of repeat. And then he realized, "I have to stop that, or else I'll go crazy." So silence and the ability to find internal quiet is a complete survival mechanism for him. And he's found that through many, many different routes, which he takes us into, and then really shows us as readers and listeners to how we can find our sphere of control, the places we do have control in our lives. And you just have to look at Jarvis's life. He has very little in his control, even when he showers, when he goes out in a day, how often he can talk on the phone. Those kinds of things are all controlled. When he eats, everything. So, and yet he still has a sphere of control, and he kind of points the way so we can find our silence and interrupt the noise in our lives, and find small pockets and deeper times of silence. And then where do we have influence? And a beautiful story of where he has influence is the guys around him on the tier. They know he's a writer. In many cases, he's helped them publish poems and different things. They lean in on him for help, but they also have started to protect his time for writing. Like, hey man, leave Jarvis alone. He's writing, yeah. So like, we don't have control over other people. You may have noticed this, Sean. I certainly noticed. But we can get some influence there, if I really care about this, this matters to me. And then those things that we don't have within our sphere of control, the outermost sphere, if you will, if that's like a bullseye, in control, influence, and then outermost, we have to let it go, or else, as Jarvis would put it, it'll make you crazy. So he's the primary teacher coming in to show us the way for finding our routes to interrupting noise and turning towards silence. And he's become a really close friend. And then he's just a beautiful being who should be free because it's the right thing.
I read his book, That Bird Has My Wings. Yeah. And it was really, there were so many moments when I was actually brought into silence, like where I just kind of had to pause. And he says, when I think about the fact that society, a nation, has sentenced me to death, all I can do is turn inside myself to the place in my heart that wants so desperately to feel human, still connected to this world, as if I have a purpose. And I think his way of responding to the noise, I mean, the noise of, I've been sentenced, right? Which is an extreme iteration of the fear of judgment that so many of us carry and condition ourselves in response to. And so his expression of like, what can I do but to turn into myself, into the place in my heart that is human, that is alive, that has intrinsic dignity, and that is the source of all that I can offer in terms of compassion and connection to others. It truly is a profound place of teaching.
When we spoke with Jarvis, he's the one who made that connection for us because it's his connection. Silence, what he finds in there is that compassion. It's his portal to deep compassion for himself and for others, and that place that brings him back to that relationship with his humanity, even though he's in this completely inhumane environment, and surrounded by it's hard. It's really, really hard. I go there for 2.5, 3 hours. I come back and I'm just like devastated. I can't do anything for a while. It's you feel it. You feel that environment that he lives in and navigates all the time. But silence is that doorway to that compassion and his humanity. And it's such a beautiful thing to bear witness to and be a part of. And I think the thing to sometimes, what I guess we've been talking about a lot lately, and I think you'll be interested in, your listeners, is that line of, okay, so there's that self-soothing and connected to humanity. And then there's also like, you got to speak up. You got to fight this. This is a broken system where this is not a time to just like go just keep meditating in your in your cell, and not, being a fuss or being the ideal, inmate there. This is, there's some shit to stir. There's some action that needs to change. There's some justice here to fight for us.
It's something that I think it's like there's two sides, right? First of all, noise is an issue of power and powerlessness.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Right? Noise is never just about sound. And then the opposite is true, as well, in the sense that we think of silence with respect to its role in the experience of injustice. There are those who silence others and those who are silenced. And you offer a reframe, and also looking at how leaders like Gandhi have harnessed the tool of silence for social justice.
Yeah, I think that quote, I won't remember exactly where it comes from, but that silence is the work of justice. And Gandhi living into that with his day of silence, no matter what was on the calendar. every week, even while taking on the British Empire. And I mean, it's just amazing to imagine, like, so I might attend this, but I'm not going to say anything. But what people said about when he would emerge from his silent Mondays to Tuesday, how he would just, the right words, the discernment that came from that silence, and probably his own wells he was able to restore, of energy, his own resourcing he was able to do, just was profound. And I think that's what I aspired to, and not to be Gandhi, but just to whatever in the little ways of my life am I turning first to silence to really get centered on the signal and that place of discernment and what's needed from me. And if the words are if there are words to be spoken, that they're the best possible words for this moment, to meet this moment, the most authentic. And then to move from there instead of in such a reactive way or a clever way, or all the ways I get kind of seduced by, just to really be bringing good into the world.
His practice was an example of the necessity to carve out time and space and practices of regenerative silence in our lives. And it's sort of like, well, if he could have done it, I think the rest of us can figure it out.
And I mean, artists and creatives have known this for some time, but the fact that, maybe we need to do that as activists, as advocates, maybe we need to do that as, in family, and figuring out how do we have those sometimes, maybe they're awkward at first conversations, but where you can sit on the porch swing side by side and not say a thing and think nothing's wrong. This is actually a sign of health.
Mm-hmm.
And a beautiful thing to build that muscle, which I know we want to head towards. Is kind of like, how do we do that together and alone? And yeah.
Well, and anecdotally, what just came to mind for me was I grew up in a household where I could watch TV anytime, and I did all the time, right?
Yeah, yeah.
My husband grew up in a household where that wasn't really going on so much. And so with our kids, it's this really interesting thing where he has really taught me that when a kid comes out and he's like, I'm bored, there's something that he's boring into. Like there's something that's like, why do we want to keep ourselves distracted all the time? And as parents, I think this really, it's like in the same way that we introduce our children to the natural world by spending time in the natural world, there's some space of sort of guardianship around allowing, just imagination and creativity to kind of go where it wants to go, right?
Yeah, and if we're parenting kids, to really let them have that unstructured time. And we, many of us have fallen into this hyper structured lifestyle. Everything's like they're in 42 like after school activities, and there's just no, I mean, school itself is still working the way it is or not working in the way it is. It's just on and on. So that unstructured time, that time for play, the sweet silence of play or being in nature, like you said. So yeah, I think this is about like building our own capacity to do that, to be guardians for those around us that we are, to help them have that space to experiment with that in our families and even in our workplaces. It's like there's this level, of deep exhaustion, and then this crazy expectation that we respond instantly to every email and every instant message and everything. And our train of thought is consistently interrupted. So that compassion and normalizing, like having it be fun, like this band where they Rosencoven, 12 umpteen piece, pagan lounge band that we interviewed, the front woman Midnight Rose, she said, when they're like playing music, they have so many instruments and there's so much going on that if it just gets too dense, one of them will shout pumpernickel. And that means they need to like bring in more silence and space into the music. And it's like, what if we did that? What if we just shouted pumpernickel on our lives and our families or whatever, and just kind of made it, instead of like being so serious about it or making it wrong or bad, it's just gotten too dense.
Yeah.
Can't hear the musicality of our lives. Some things that we we're told about and have certainly played with ourselves is to do what we're already doing, but just say 10% slower or deeper. Think about transitions a little differently from one thing to the next, that we might just take a beat or a pause or a breath, say moving. This is from one of our interviewees, amazing man, Aaron Maniam, but when he transitions from one thing to another, like say a room, just to take a breath as he holds the doorknob to go to another thing. When he closes a document, opens a document, or even to start like conversation like this, to just give yourself a beat or two, and to notice those moments, like the magic of transitions, instead of just basically trying to cram everything in. But then, how can we do this at work? Can we block some deep thinking time together so we can do that deep work and protect one another? Even like the men on the tier who were saying, Jarvis, he's writing, like, can we get better at actually preserving time for one another, carving that out for our partners, for our coworkers, for our friends.
Allowing a beat before responding to my husband, like allowing his words to land before responding, because we can be in this flow of like, but just like, and it's such a small thing, right? It's like one breath. And so I really appreciated how many of these recommended practices are not like separate from it's not like, okay, I'm going to go, now I'm going to have my practice time over here. It's like they're just interwoven, these small moments, a few breaths here or there, and a recentering attention, or a spaciousness to allow something that we're receiving to more fully sort of circulate in the moment, before responding.
That'll change, that little 2-degree shift, you'll end up in a different continent. I mean, that's big stuff, actually. Little stuff, big stuff. But when I remember to do that, that conversation with my husband goes just radically different. He feels heard, he feels respected. We interrupt the cycle of we're very quick, we're very mental, we love our words, all those things, and we'll just get into a whole frenzy. But if we can take those beats, I know if I'm on the receiving end of that, it's like, oh, okay, now we're really communicating. Thank you for that. And if we do the same thing in a hard space and a really in a difficult place, if we can do that even more and sit in that fire, then we're really changing some patterns, and that's what I'm here to do.
Leigh, what a joy. Thank you so much for this rich conversation. I was thinking this morning about this poem by Wendell Berry, How to Be a Poet. And it feels so resonant to sort of complete this conversation with. This is really an offering of thanks back to you for your journey of exploration, which you then have been able to offer as a gift for others.
I can't wait. Yeah.
This is just the last stanza of the poem. How to be a poet. And then I love, he puts in parentheses, to remind myself. Accept what comes from silence. Make the best you can of it. Of the little words that come out of the silence, like prayers prayed back to the one who prays. Make a poem that does not disturb the silence from which it came.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Leigh.
Oh, thank you so much.
Hey friends, thank you so much for listening today. If you find value in these conversations, here's how you can support. Become a subscriber at seanperel.substack.com, and please rate, review, and share your favorite episode with a friend. I leave you with an original song written by Serena Joy Bixby for all of us still learning what it means to be human. Is it love? Is it hate? Grief or heartache, or what? does it mean
be human. Is it tears? Is it laughter? Is it not knowing what comes after? What does it mean to be human? Well, I'm sure I don't know. This life, where it goes. The days come, the days go, and I'm still human. Oh, one thing I know for sure is I'm looking for more. Gonna go out, learn what it means to be human. I find the joy in the mess. Oh, I'm just doing my best. Oh, learning what it means being human. Oh, learning what it means being human. I'm learning. Oh, learning what it means being